Chapter 4, Section 2, we're going to discuss cellular respiration, one of the most important chemical processes that occur in all living cells. Now, a couple of questions to think about. Do all cells breathe? Do plants breathe? Why must animals like us breathe? What do we mean by the word breathe? We're going to talk about that in this section. And of course, I hope you recognize this particular picture. That's our mitochondria. But looking at Section 2, our first objective asks us to define cellular respiration. We're going to go back and describe ATP and what the functions of ATP are. We're going to look at the relationship between breathing and cellular respiration. We're going to actually practice writing the formula for aerobic cellular respiration. Describe the structure of the mitochondria, look at the stages of cellular respiration, and some really neat little electron carrier molecules. We're going to cover the first half of this section, and then we'll do the second half in a separate segment. So objective number 1 for section 2, define cellular respiration. Excuse me. Cellular respiration is a series of metabolic reactions or chemical reactions that convert food energy into ATP energy, which is the usable form of energy for a cell. We refer to ATP as the universal intracellular source of organic energy. So that's basically energy for organic cells. You have energy in your home. It's provided by the flow of electrons. Flow of electrons gives us energy for our lights, our TVs. The flow of electrons in the battery of your phone gives you energy for your cell phone. When you use up all those electrons, the phone is dead. We plug it in, we recharge it with more electrons, and we can use it again. That's similar to how ATP works in living cells. Just like gasoline or the octane, and the gasoline is the fuel for your automobile. It's what your truck or your car burns to give it energy to go down the road. ATP is the fuel source for our living cells. It's what our cells use to provide all the energy for doing the different jobs that our cells need to do. Just like you see in this little stopper gun that we all played with as kids, it has a spring in there. When the spring is compressed or cocked backwards, it has stored energy. Like that ATP molecule, it has stored energy. When we flip the trigger here or mash the I guess it is a trigger. When you pull the trigger, it shoots the little stopper and the energy is released. When we pull the trigger or break the bonds in our ATP molecules, energy is released for our cells to do work. Objective number 2 asks us about the specific structure of an ATP molecule. Now, I encourage you to practice these big words. You need to know what they mean, but you're welcome to use the initials when you're taking notes or talking about it because it's just much easier. But ATP refers to adenosine triphosphate. That tells us that our nitrogen base is adenine and we have 3 phosphate groups. ATP is a special type of nucleotide, which we've already discussed in Unit 1. Remember, nucleic acids was one of our 4 organic families, along with carbs and proteins and your lipids or fats. But nucleotides have 3 specific parts. They have a nitrogen-containing base, they have a sugar, and they have phosphate group. In this particular case, like we said, ATP is special. It has the nitrogenous base, adenine. It has a pentose, or a 5-carbon sugar named ribose. That's the same kind of sugar that makes up RNA, ribonucleic acid. And then it has 3 phosphate groups. Now, a phosphate group is technically a PO4. It has oxygens all around it. That's not represented in this picture. And it does have the negative charges. That means it has extra electrons. And we just discussed the fact that electrons provide energy for us. Energy is stored in the chemical bonds between these phosphates. The outside bond has the highest energy. The second bond does have a good bit of energy, but not as much as the outside one. Excuse me. So we normally just break this outside bond and release that energy and those electrons, and that gives us good energy for our cells to do their work, or whatever job that each cell has its particular job to do for our bodies. In objective number 3, it says exactly what kind of jobs does ATP do. ATP functions in cellular work. First of all, we need ATP for mechanical work, actually movement of cells, like the flipping of these flagella so this little Chlamydomonas can swim through the pond water. The fluffing of cilia that keeps giving me this tickle in my throat. The cilia is fluffing up dust particles or maybe peanut dust or whatever that keeps giving me these issues with my coughing spells. But movement of your muscles, when you blink your eyes, when your heart beats, keeping your diaphragm moving so your lungs can inflate and we can breathe, that's mechanical work, actually movement in our bodies and in our cells. It requires ATP, tons of ATP. Transport work, we just talked about transport. What kind of transport requires ATP? Active transport. Those pump mechanisms that pump things across that phospholipid bilayer, they require ATP. Other forms of active transport like endocytosis and exocytosis, all active transport processes require ATP for that work to be done. And then chemical work, the work of our enzymes. A lot of our enzymes require the help of ATP molecules. It helps us build things and break down things. So actually in the process of chemical equations taking place and making complex molecules and how our enzymes function requires ATP as well. So in chemical reactions, in cellular transport, and in mechanical work or movement, that's how we burn literally tons and tons of ATP molecules, using those for the energy for our cells. When we use ATP, we start out with adenosine triphosphate. When we break up one of those bonds and liberate that energy, we end up with ADP, or adenosine diphosphate, and it needs to be recharged. This is kind of like we use up the electrons in a battery, or whoops, I beeped it too quick. We use up the electrons in a battery. You use up the electrons in your phone. When you use up all the electrons in your phone, you say the battery's dead and it needs to be recharged. Well, ADP is kind of like a weak battery. It's lost that phosphate bond and it needs to be regenerated like it says up here. So in cellular respiration, we get energy from the food that we consume. Hopefully break that down into glucose, something easy to burn. We get the energy from the food that we consume and we use that energy to rebond that phosphate, and we end up with ATP once again. See, we rebonded that phosphate and that regenerated our ATP. So cellular respiration is the chemical process of constantly regenerating and producing ATP from the ADP that we've already used up. And the energy to do that comes from the nutrients we consume. If we're not consuming the proper nutrients, we don't have energy to make enough ATP, so our mechanical work is weak, our chemical work is weak, our immune system is weak, our metabolic activities are weak, transport processes don't function properly, so we're not functioning healthily or efficiently if we don't eat the proper food to keep our ATP regenerated. We get brain fog, we can't think clear, we're tired and lethargic all the time, feel droopy and yucky, and it could be that you're not able to produce enough ATP to keep your cells energized. Our next point that I wanted to point out is the breathing thing. We asked those questions earlier. Do cells breathe? Do plants breathe? The process of breathing is actually ventilation. Air comes out of a vent. If somebody's really sick in the hospital, they put them on a vent or a ventilator. So the process of inhalation and exhalation is actually ventilation. Cellular respiration does use the oxygen from that, but it is a metabolic process. It is a chemical reaction that occurs in our cells. So like it says, breathing is ventilation. It's inhalation of oxygen into the lungs to be delivered to our cells, and then we exhale the carbon dioxide. Cellular respiration actually occurs within our cells, within the mitochondria, if it is aerobic cellular respiration. And our tissues, our mitochondria suck in the oxygen, and our tissues use that energy, and we exhale the carbon dioxide as a waste product. So just keep in mind that breathing and cellular respiration are technically not the same thing if you understand the proper science terminology for that. Okay, our next objective asks us to describe the structure of a mitochondria. Now this should be reviewed. These same parts were labeled in our previous chapter, but you do recognize the mitochondria is kind of an oblong, maybe peanut-shaped or kidney bean-shaped organ. It has a double layers of membranes, an outer and an inner membrane, and that inner membrane makes these little enfoldings or layers across the midsection. Whoa, 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 it's going crazy. Across the midsection of our mitochondria. And those inner membranes are called crista. And that's an important part to remember, because that's where part of our cellular respiration takes place. The other important thing to remember is the matrix. That's the inner solution, or this calls it a semi-fluid. It's full of good enzymes. That's your oxygen sponge. Oxygen is actually absorbed into the mitochondria and is within that mitochondrial matrix. But that solution within the mitochondria is a very rich soup that contains enzymes and oxygen that promotes cellular respiration to occur. So be sure you review the structure of your mitochondria and can draw and label all those parts. And then later you're going to have to be able to tell the specific processes that are occurring at each of those locations. Then number 5 says, state the chemical formula for aerobic cellular respiration, which here it is in bold. And I also have it in words underneath that'll make it a little bit easier for you. You need to practice writing this equation. You need to do it several times. Put the labels underneath so that you can get it in your head and remember. But it says, be able to state the chemical formula for aerobic cellular respiration. We need to identify the reactants and the products for this reaction, and identify the location of the processes and the requirement for complete catabolism of glucose. So number 5 is a pretty big one. So here is our chemical equation for aerobic cellular respiration. You should recognize this as glucose, C6H12O6, that's glucose. This, of course, is oxygen. H2O is water, carbon dioxide, and then our ATP energy. So what this is telling us is our reactants are glucose and oxygen. Remember, reactants on the left. Our products, what we produce, is water, carbon dioxide, and ATP energy. The products are always on the right. This process actually occurs within the mitochondria for the most part, and it requires oxygen. The oxygen is available within the matrix of the mitochondria, but it requires oxygen to completely burn or to completely break down that entire molecule. Now down here you see a structural formula. We have little glucose structure in our lab room, and you see all the carbons, the 6 carbons, the oxygens, the hydrogens in that one big molecule. It is eventually broken down and sucked into the mitochondria. It interacts with the oxygen that's in the mitochondrial matrix, and we produce tons and tons of ATP energy. We also produce water and carbon dioxide as a byproduct. Those two byproducts basically come out your nose. That's what you exhale. You exhale the water that's produced, and you exhale the carbon dioxide. Now if I asked you how much oxygen is needed to burn one glucose molecule? Well, whoops, clicked it too fast. One glucose molecule requires 6 oxygens to actually completely break it down. And if I took my little model that's in the lab room and I just pulled all the carbons and hydrogens and oxygens and added these oxygens to it and just laid it there on the table, you'd have all those little red and blue and white little circles that represent carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. If I took all those apart and then I rebuilt with them, I would be able to build 6 water molecules and 6 carbon dioxide molecules that are a byproduct of this aerobic cellular respiration process. But the most important thing we're after is our energy molecules, which are the ATP. So we stated the chemical formula, we identified the reactants, glucose and oxygen, we identified the products, that's my water, my carbon dioxide, and my ATP. The location is basically in the mitochondria because that's where our oxygen is, and the requirement for complete catabolism or breakdown of glucose is the availability of oxygen. If you don't have oxygen available, there are some organisms that undergo anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration is cellular respiration without using oxygen. And we can't completely break down the glucose and we don't make nearly as much ATP, but we talk about anaerobic respiration all the way down to number 15. So we'll save that for later. All right, number 6 says list the stages of cellular respiration. Cellular respiration actually occurs in 3 different steps or 3 different stages. The first one is called glycolysis. You should recognize lysis as being, bursting, coming apart. So we are taking apart our glucose. So this is glucolysis, breaking the glucose down. Then the second stage is the citric acid cycle, or the citrate or Krebs cycle. The citric acid cycle, let me just say this, glycolysis occurs in the cytosol, and we'll review this again. Citric acid cycle occurs in the matrix, uses the oxygen in the matrix, and that's where the citric acid cycle takes place. And then our electron transport chain, or ETC, and ATP synthesis occurs in those little folded membranes, or the crista. So this particular objective asks us to just list the stages. Objectives following will ask us the specifics of each one of these steps. So remember, stage 1 is glycolysis, stage 2 is the citric acid cycle, and stage 3 is electron transport chain and ATP synthesis. Now, objective number 7 asks us to explain the role of some important molecules. They're called FAD plus and FAD plus in cellular respiration. We've already mentioned the fact that the movement of electrons gives us energy. And in the first 2 stages, glycolysis and the citric acid cycle, we're actually breaking bonds and liberating electrons. And we've got to capture those electrons to keep them from damaging the cell and be able to use that energy. Just like in a battery, we recharge a battery, we plug it in to capture electrons with it. That's what we use it for. Now there are 2 important molecules found in living cells. One of them is nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. Now you can say that really fast, you can practice the big words, again you can use the initials as long as you understand what you're talking about. But we have nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, and we have flavin adenine dinucleotide. Those are special types of nucleotides that we call electron carriers. You notice these positives, positive signs. What does that mean? That means you have lost electrons. So these particular things are kind of like, right now, they're like a dead battery or an empty taxi. There's nothing in there. Okay, because we have the positives, we don't have our electrons. However, when we can use hydrogen ions, which also have a positive charge, they help us pick up extra electrons. So our taxi cab becomes full. We collect electrons along with hydrogen ions, and that's what loads up our taxi, or what recharges our battery, just like we use rechargeable batteries in our flashlights and other things. If you recall, electrons are super tiny. They travel super fast, like at the speed of light. It would be very difficult to try to capture something like that and hang on to it. So we use the help of hydrogen ions that have this extra positive charge, and that helps us collect electrons. When these two things combine and we collect electrons, it gets rid of that positive charge, we end up with NADH. That again is like a full taxi cab or a recharged battery. It's carrying electrons for its final destination. Same thing for the flavin, adenine dinucleotide. It will pick up two hydrogen ions and pick up extra electrons and then help transport those electrons to step 3, which is the electron transport chain. So here we have our empty taxi, our dead battery, so to speak. They're missing their electrons. In the citric acid cycle, we actually pick up extra electrons and recharge our battery or fill up our taxi cab. And this is just an overview of the glycolysis stage, where our glucose is being broken down initially, and then it enters the mitochondria along with the oxygen, and that's where the citric acid cycle and electron transport takes place. And we produce a lot of carbon dioxide, we produce water, and most importantly, we produce ATP, which is the energy that we're looking for. Now, that was the first half of our objectives. Go back and review your basic definitions and explanations, and then we'll do this second half. These are the objectives for the second half of Section 2.